Even though we've had to travel a lot around the South Island of New Zealand to find unique shots, this time this was right outside of our apartment in Queenstown, so we didn't have to go far at all. Right now I'm sitting on a really nice dock on Lake Wakatipu, which is the lake that surrounds Queenstown. Queenstown is a really beautiful place for photography. There are so many places to just drive around and stop and enjoy the lakeside views and take great photos. So it's interesting right now that I'm sitting on this nice dock that's facing the mountain range of the Remarkables, because dock shots in general have become sort of the cliche of landscape photographers and a very cliche for long exposure photographers, both in color and black and white. So you're probably familiar with somebody's portfolio. You've seen a shot looking down a dock into a mountain range or a nice sunset or anything like that. And the reason it's become cliche is because it's done a lot, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be done. It's a very beautiful way to incorporate a foreground element leading into water and a background. So it's done a lot for a reason, because it is actually pretty beautiful. And in this case here, it's an awesome lake, and it's a great example to show you guys how I use focus stacking to make sure that everything in my image is sharp throughout, from forward all the way to the back. Up until this point, we haven't had anything super close to the lens. And the other thing that I've been doing a lot for this landscape tutorial is I've been shooting ultra wide. And when you shoot ultra wide, everything is pretty much in focus at infinite, as long as nothing's right up to the lens. We've talked about that quite a bit. But on this shot, I've chosen to do something a little bit different. Rather than shooting at 16mm, I decided to shoot at 35mm. That goes back to a little bit of what we talked about compression. If I zoom in, it tends to compress the environment, where if I were to shoot at 16mm, it would spread everything out. So those mountains would become very distant. So what I've done here, instead of shooting at 16, I've stood back a little bit from the dock and zoomed into 35mm so that I could compress the dock with the background, because I wanted the mountains to be pretty predominant. I didn't want them to just fade away into the distance. Because I'm shooting at 35mm, I'm no longer at a wide angle. So that means anything close to my lens now is going to be out of focus if I just focus at infinite. For this shot, I'm not just going to show you guys focus stacking. We're also going to be doing some timed exposures. In this case, it's going to be 30 seconds using a neutral density filter and a graduated neutral density filter to make this a little bit more interesting. Now, since this is a shot that's done a lot, you always want to make it a little bit more interesting than just going on the dock and shooting it standard, because if you can see the ripples of the water in the sky, it doesn't look as interesting as if everything's smoothed out and soft. Throughout this tutorial, we've seen the difference between water that's static and water that's soft. So this is going to be a nice example of when soft water really adds to the scene. My camera's all set up, and I've focused to infinite by focusing on the tip of the mountain in the background there. I've also set my white balance to right around 6,000, so it's a little bit warm, as I usually like to shoot warm for long exposures. So the next step is to use the 10-stop Firecrest neutral density filter so that we can do some longer exposures. So I'm just going to add that to the front of the camera here. With the light the way it is, it looks like I can get a 30-second exposure by putting my ISO down to low 1.0 and my f-stop to f11. So take a look at this shot. It looks pretty good, but there's a couple problems. First problem, the sky's a little bit blown out. The foreground looks good, and it all looks pretty much in focus if we take a look at it like this, but let's zoom in on one of those posts in the foreground. So as you can see, that post is just a little bit blurry. At this point, we have a few options to get everything in focus. I'm only at f11. I could go up to f22. So let me do that really quick. I'm going to go up to f22. I'm going to change my settings since I'm doing 30-second exposures. By going up to f22, I'll probably have to do about ISO 200 to compensate to keep things right around 30 seconds. So let's go ahead and do that first. All right, take a look at this shot at f22. Everything looks pretty good again. Sky's still a little bit blown out, but let's go ahead and zoom right into that same post. So now you can see it's almost in focus. Going up to f22 has definitely given us more sharpness throughout our image, even though it's still a little bit soft. By this time, you guys have noticed that I really like to keep things around f8 or f11. f8 and f11 is usually right around a lens's sweet spot, which means you don't get any vignetting, you don't get any diffraction, and you usually don't get any chromatic aberration on higher end lenses. But it also gives you some other advantages. When you're shooting at f/22, for example, you see everything that's wrong with your camera sensor, every piece of dust, every piece of dirt on the outside of the filter, and you get massive amounts of vignetting. So when you shoot long exposures at f/22, you have a massive amount of cleanup to do in the sky. All these little dots, all these little dust and scratch spots, everything you have to do, you have to manually remove it using the clone stamp or the heel brush. So I never usually want to do that. Another problem with shooting at f/22 with long exposure is you get the extra vignetting. Now, think about your f-stop being really, really small, so you're having to squeeze all that light through a tiny opening. When you add a 10-stop neutral density filter to the end of that, then you're squeezing less light through this tiny little opening, so you're only going to come into problems when you're shooting long exposure. It can also cause some of the color issues that people find with long exposure photography. Now, when I do my long exposure photography, I always set my custom white balance. A lot of people think that they're getting color casting when they're actually just relying on their auto white balance. So if you're shooting an auto white balance and using higher f-stops around f/22, you may get some color casting with your neutral density filters that actually don't exist. They're a product of not setting your white balance correctly and shooting at f/22. So looking at f/11 and seeing that the foreground post is pretty blurry, looking at f/22 and seeing that the post is almost sharp, somewhere in between, if we were to go to somewhere around f/16, we could get the best of both worlds and use a hyperfocal distance to get everything to be mostly sharp. But I'm not the type of photographer that likes to have my stuff mostly sharp. I like to have it tack sharp throughout. So before we get into focus stacking, let's quickly fix the problem in the sky. And the easiest way to do that is to add a 3-stop Format High-Tech graduated neutral density filter. Something you may have noticed is that when I add filters, I like to take the whole cover off my camera. The reason I do that is if I want to do any blending, and in this case I'm going to have to blend the background focal with the foreground focal, I don't want to disrupt the camera, and by pushing this down, I may disrupt the camera. So if I do all this stuff in my hands here and then just put it on the front of it, I have less chance of disrupting the position of my camera. So what I'll do is I'll just adjust this to compensate for the sky. Now the nice thing about this too is it's going to give me 3 extra stops at the top and 1 near the bottom. So what I'm just trying to do is slide it so that it gives me extra neutral density just in the sky so that I can concentrate on exposing for the foreground and I won't blow out the sky. So let's go ahead and add this to the front of the camera really quick. Very carefully add it to the front of the camera so I don't disrupt it. All right. Now that both filters are in place, let's take that same shot 30 seconds at f/11. Take a look at this shot now. You can see that the sky is exposed correctly and everything else still looks pretty good. So we've been able to nail this in a single exposure, which is going to make post-processing much more simple. This shot looks pretty good. It may not be a portfolio shot. We have some shadows in the foreground from the light, but it's still a very nice composition. And right now, everything's focused on the background, so that's part 1. The next step is to refocus the camera on an element in the foreground. In this case, I'm going to use the post to the left because that's pretty much the closest thing to the camera. I'm going to reset the focus, and I'm going to take the exact same shot. Here's a situation where you can either trust the autofocus, which I do on my Nikon D810. Just with my Nikon D810, I usually go to the live view, I turn the f-stop all the way down, in this case to 4, and I put the target right on the area that I want to focus, and I focus, and then I double check on the top. It's up to you whether you want to use the autofocus or if you want to manually focus. If you're using a camera like the Fujifilm X-T1 or other mirrorless cameras, they have focus peaking, which allows you to just twist the focus ring and get highlights around the edges that are in focus. DSLRs don't have that, so we either have to rely on the autofocus or manual focus with our own eyes. I tend to trust the autofocus a little bit than my own vision, unless I can really zoom in, especially when it's a little bit bright out here. It's hard to see the back of the screen. So I'll usually use the autofocus in the camera and then I'll sort of double check just to make sure that it didn't go crazy or anything like that. We talked about focusing with the live view a little bit in the basics, but it actually is the best way to focus. Not only that, but I have neutral density filters on the front of my camera and I'm on f/11. So when I flip on the live view at f/11, my camera's going to have a hard time focusing accurately because I have 10 to 13 stops of neutral density on top of f11. So turning it all the way down to f4, or if you have an f2.8 lens, allows more light into the camera and gives you a more accurate read on the focus. So every time I refocus my camera, I flip to live view, turn the f-stop all the way down, pick the area that I want to focus on, refocus, and then reset my f-stop. And then I know that I'm going to get the most accurate focus every time. Let's take a look at the second shot that's focused on the foreground. Viewing at 100%, it looks exactly the same. But what happens if we zoom into that post? Notice how the post is perfectly sharp now? Let's take a look at the previous shot. Now you can see how it's soft. So what I have done is I've focused for one shot on the background and one shot on the foreground. Now, this is very simple focus stacking because I'm only using 2 layers of focus stacking. I've focused on the background and the foreground, and then in Photoshop, I'm going to use a gradient ramp to blend between the focal points. So I use the sharp part of the foreground and the sharp part of the background together. Now again, it's very simple. Some focus stacking, if you're very close to something and there are elements that are very far away, require more than just 2 layers of focus stacking. And if you get into macro photography, for example, it can require dozens of layers of different focus to put together. And there are pieces of software that do this for you. But for this kind of stuff, it's actually easier to do it manually in Photoshop. Focus stacking is a really powerful tool, but there are some limitations. Well, right now I'm using it because everything's static. The dock is static, the background is static, and by shooting a 30-second exposure, I've actually softened the water, so there's no crucial masking of any kind. I can basically just paint in the foreground, and the water is always going to match up because it's always soft. Imagine a different situation though. Imagine if I was trying to focus stack on some plants in the foreground and some mountains in the background, and those plants were swaying around. If I were to take one shot of the plants perfectly in focus and then the mountain in the background, the plants will move. So there'd be no way to put those back together because there'd be too much motion behind it. In order to put it back together, it would require a ton of Photoshop. I'd actually have to paint out part of the plants that were blurry, mask in part of the plants that were sharp, and it would actually be a Photoshop nightmare. It would be possible, but it would be hours and hours worth of work. So in that type of situation, it would be wise to either shoot wide where you don't have to focus stack, or if you're in a situation where you do have things very near and far away from the camera, to calculate the hyperfocal distance because you won't have anything complex to blend together. All in all, this should be a really simple blend in Photoshop. The water's really soft, everything's really static, the lighting didn't change too much throughout, so we'll take a look at the easy steps to blend this focus stacking together. Welcome back to the studio. This is lesson 11, and we are going to learn how to use the images that we shot focus stack. So remember on the dock, I shot 2 different long exposures, which was really nice. One focused infinite on the background, and one focused very close to the foreground on actually one of the posts to the left. So what I've done here in Lightroom, I've brought both of the best images that I've gotten in so we can take a look. So let's take a look at Lightroom. If you've loaded up this Lightroom, obviously it's just 2 different files. One is focused on the background and one is focused on the foreground. If I zoom in here, you can see that this one's pretty well focused. If I go to this one here, let it load, you can see that it's completely out of focus. So we have the foreground focus and we have the background focus. Now I didn't use the focus plane on the foreground so much. What I actually used was the focus area around here. So this is how I locked it in. If we zoom into the background here, I just want to show you guys one more time. We have one here, and of course I forgot to do this on the Lightroom file, so I'll just show you guys a little bit manually here. We have a blurry background and we have a focused background. So it's pretty self-explanatory, one for the other. So what we're going to have to do is just decide which one we like to work with first. Personally, I like to work with a focused background first and then work forward to the foreground. So the first thing we have to do is do a little bit of balancing in here. Again, this is not a portfolio shot, this is just a demonstration. If you wait for sunset, and sunset this could have been golden light, there could have been a really nice sort of an atmospheric effect, and it could have turned into a really nice image. But this day the lighting was harsh, and we had gotten all the way through New Zealand. I wanted to make sure I showed you guys how to put together a focus stacked image. So we're going to go ahead and just make some basic adjustments to this. Nothing too wide. I'm just going to pull the shadows up just a little bit. And anything that I do here, if I do the shadows, if I do the exposure a little bit more, bring it up, bring the highlights down. However I want to balance this, I just want to make sure that it stays consistent throughout. So once I have selected everything that I want to do to this image, again, just Command-click, develop settings, sync settings. And I can actually sync everything because it's not going to change too much. And then everything will be good. So again, we have to figure out, do we want to start with the focused foreground or do we want to start with the focused background? And I'm going to go ahead and start with the focused background. I'm going to say export, export, because I changed it the previous lesson. We had put to a folder. So this one I want to make sure that we can go back into that temp directory where I like to dump all the PSDs, and this time open it in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and bring that in here. Good. So this is where we can really see this effect taking shape. So we have a focused foreground, a blurry foreground. Very, very noticeable. But if we come up here to the background, now we have the difference of a sharp background and a blurry background. So this is what I like to do when I have to increase or widen the depth of field when I'm shooting. In this case it was 35mm. If I would have been shooting at 14mm, the scene would have looked distinctly different. I probably would have not needed to focus stack. So before we get into the blending portion of this, which is pretty straightforward, if you did not focus stack your images, let's say that you wanted to try to add focus, what can you do inside of Photoshop to help mitigate some of the blur? What tools do we have? Well, Photoshop actually has a tool called shake reduction. I'm going to duplicate this layer first, and under filter, we can go to sharpen and shake reduction. Shake reduction is really meant to be used when you have handheld images, and if it shakes just a little bit, it can correct it actually and be pretty impressive with the correction. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to do a good job. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this bounding box so it analyzes a selection range. And it's going to go through and try to detect those edges, and you can see what it's doing here. It's basically making it look really bad. So we're going to change the blur trace bounds just a little bit, soften that up a little bit, and we're also going to smooth it and take down some of the artifacts. And that's also not looking pretty good. So just right off the bat here, just trying to get this to be better. It's just not quite working. I'm going to see if I can get a result out of here that looks pretty good with the shake reduction, and I'm just going to go ahead and apply it and see what happens. So just say OK, and we'll see what we can get out of this. There we go. Let's go ahead and zoom in and take a look. So here we have, basically we have the before and we have the after. So actually that's a little bit better. You can see that it's brought it into focus just a little bit. So it's not as bad. I'd say it's corrected it just a little bit. Other things we can do, put a high pass filter on it, try to chisel it out even more, but we're still going to end up with blurry detail, especially compared to the sharp version. You can see how much of a difference when it is all in focus to when we've corrected the focus to when we haven't corrected the focus. So this is definitely a clear winner in this situation. So really with this, all that's left to do is to blend in the portion of the sharp version in the foreground over the blurry version in the background. The nice thing is most of this is over water, which is non-crucial for blending. This is where it actually is a little bit tricky when we replace the blending here. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and black this out with a mask so that we have our full focused background. This area around here is in focus, so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to draw a gradient from about here to here. So I'm going to hit G for gradient. I'm going to select my mask, and I actually want this to exist from here to about here. And you can see that that's going to pull that foreground into focus, and it's actually starting to look pretty good. And since I used a gradient, it's pretty seamless. So now we have a fully focused foreground. But if we look at our mask here, you can see that I'm still going to need to add in some of this post. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and pick the brush tool and let's go ahead and custom brush in some of this with a opacity of, I would say, flow maybe 20%. I'm just going to start painting this back in so that it's nice and sharp and nice and sharp. The nice thing about the water is I can go ahead and draw more water in, just more water in this area. Now here's where it gets really difficult with focus stacking. When you have areas of interest and you're covering up areas of interest. So this is where you have to be very careful. Obviously you want the post to be really sharp, right in the center here, but watch what happens if I go outside. I'm going to start blurring some of that background. So this is, there's no real way to finesse this completely without cloning in the difference. So what I'm doing is just trying to blend in some of the focus and some of the soft focus around this post. And you can see that this is the before and the after, just so it basically visually looks like it's as perfect as possible. Same thing here, I'm going to have to paint this post back in, and as I paint that post back in, I'm also going to start painting in some of the water. Since the water is going to be a little bit different, you can see there's ducks over there to the right, so they're moving, water's moving, so the long exposures are going to be close, but not exactly perfect. Again, this kind of stuff over top of a sky, no problem at all. But as soon as we start going over parts of the background, then we have an issue. So we want to make sure that we get all those edges intact. And this is a really easy example. Some examples are going to get more difficult, and you're also going to need more ranges, more areas to focus on. So if you think about macro photography, and you've seen macro photography where everything's in focus, it's not that super shallow depth of field look, it's because it's actually focus stacked. And you can have anywhere from 10 to 30 to 40 different focal planes, and then they put it together. So there is software out there that you can get that will do all that for you. If you find yourself focus stacking all the time, then it might be worth picking up some of that software. For this, I wanted you guys to be able to do it manually, and this is just a really quick example. In the field, feel free to do some complex stuff. If you're really close, like if you're in a meadow of flowers, for example, and there's a mountainscape in the background, and you're right up on those flowers, try to focus stack for the flowers, and then the middle ground, and then the background. And using this process, starting either forward back or back forward, I prefer back forward, use the infinite focus, then bring in the middle ground focus, paint that in, and then paint in the flowers or whatever's completely in front. The very front of your camera. And that's going to give you some really nice results when you can't get everything in focus in one shot. So other than that with this file, it is not a portfolio shot. It's just a classic dock shot, but it's not even that nice. The shadows aren't very nice or anything like that. So this is a nice thing to revisit during a sunset or a sunrise when you have that soft golden light. But for all intents and purposes right now, you can see that even with this mask, what I've created, this easy, simple garbage mask, I've managed to just go ahead and get all of this back into focus instead of having it blurry in the foreground. So this is going to give you the ability to get everything in focus and have everything rock solid in your scene and not have to rely on the hyperfocal distance. Because remember what I said about hyperfocal? Hyperfocal means that everything's mostly in focus, and I'd rather everything be 100% in focus. So this was a really simple lesson, but that pretty much wraps it up. The next one's going to get back into some really cool landscapes in New Zealand, and we're going to be exploring some new and more advanced options.